The video opens on a rainy evening in the city. The sound of raindrops hitting the pavement blends with the quiet hum of the bustling street, creating an almost serene backdrop as people rush to find shelter. The camera slowly zooms in on Judge Maya Carter, a powerful black woman in her early 40s. She walks briskly, her heels clicking against the wet sidewalk with precision and confidence. In one hand, she carries a briefcase, in the other, an umbrella, shielding herself from the downpour. Judge Carter, known for her sharp intellect and strong presence, has just finished presiding over a difficult case at the courthouse. Her demeanor reflects the gravity of her role. She's seen as a leader in the legal community, admired for her commitment to justice, especially in fighting racial inequality within the legal system. As the camera focuses on her face, there's a subtle expression of both exhaustion and determination. Her work is never done, but she carries the weight with grace. As she heads toward her car, the scene shifts as a police car pulls up beside her. The officer inside, Officer Harrison, watches her, his eyes narrowing as he drives past. The camera captures the suspicion in his eyes before he suddenly makes a sharp U-turn and parks directly in front of her. He steps out of the car, walking toward her with purpose. Without a word, Officer Harrison approaches Judge Carter. The camera zooms in on his expression. He's sizing her up, as if determining whether or not she belongs. He opens his mouth to speak. "Ma'am, can I see your ID?" His tone is flat, but there's an undeniable edge of judgment. Judge Carter stops in her tracks, momentarily stunned by the unexpected request. Her eyebrows raise slightly, her expression showing confusion, and perhaps even disbelief. "Excuse me?" she responds, her voice calm but laced with uncertainty, as she tries to understand the situation. The camera catches her momentary pause, a flicker of recognition in her eyes as she wonders why she's being stopped. The officer repeats, his voice more insistent this time. "I said, show me your ID, ma'am." The tone is sharper now, the clash of authority palpable. Judge Carter doesn't flinch. She stands tall, confident in her identity and her position, but a subtle tension builds in the air. She stares directly at the officer, the camera zooming in on her face to highlight the moment. The rain falls harder, but it's the brewing confrontation that takes center stage. The clash of authority feels like a storm in its own right. The escalating tension between Judge Carter and Officer Harrison is palpable. Despite the suddenness of the encounter, Judge Carter's composure remains unshaken. She has spent years facing scrutiny and overcoming the bias that comes with being a black woman in a position of power. Her mind races, but her expression stays steady, and she refuses to show fear or uncertainty. "What's the reason for this stop, officer?" she asks, her voice calm but firm. "I'm just trying to get to my car." Instead of addressing her question, Officer Harrison steps closer. His gaze lingers on her, sizing her up in a way that feels personal, a silent judgment that goes beyond her appearance. "You're acting suspicious," he says, his tone dripping with disdain. "It's not common to see someone like you in this part of town." He pauses before adding, "You've been walking around here too long." The words hang in the air, sharp and insulting. Judge Carter feels the sting of his bias, but she doesn't show it. Her gaze sharpens, eyes narrowing just slightly, a subtle shift that signals she's not backing down. "I don't see how me walking in my own city is suspicious," she responds, her tone laced with quiet authority. "I'm a judge. I have a right to be in any part of this city." But instead of backing off, Officer Harrison steps even closer, his presence looming over her. The camera zooms in, focusing on his smug expression, and his fingers hover near his belt, signaling his growing aggression. Without warning, he snatches the bag from her hand. The camera catches the swift movement, the harshness of his grip as he holds the bag up high, out of her reach. Judge Carter's breath catches for a moment. The clear physical intimidation sends a surge of frustration through her. She immediately tries to reclaim the bag, but Officer Harrison pulls it further away. Her frustration boils over as her patience begins to wear thin. "I'm not handing you anything, officer," she says, her voice no longer steady, but now edged with irritation. "You've crossed the line now. I'll be reporting this." Her words carry weight, and she knows the power of her position. But this situation is no longer about just her identity as a judge. It's about respect and dignity. The officer stares at her with a mixture of arrogance and disbelief. His grip tightens around the bag as if he's daring her to do something. The camera lingers on his face, showing the tension between his expectations and the fact that he's dealing with someone who isn't backing down. At this moment, the situation escalates. A crowd begins to gather around them, sensing that something significant is unfolding. The buzz of murmurs fills the air, the onlookers unsure of what to do, but instinctively aware that this isn't a typical exchange. Some of the people begin pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation, as the power dynamics between Officer Harrison and Judge Carter begin to shift. The camera focuses on Judge Carter's expression, which is a mix of annoyance and resolve. Her hands remain steady as she keeps eye contact with Officer Harrison, refusing to show fear or submission. She is a woman who is used to challenging authority, but always within the bounds of the law. As the officer glares at her, his posture shifts, signaling his uncertainty. The camera lingers on his face as he struggles to figure out how to regain control of the situation, but he's no longer in charge. The tension between them builds as the crowd watches in silence, some eyes wide, others glued to their phones, knowing that something is about to happen. The camera shifts back to Judge Carter, who now stands tall, her body language radiating strength. Her voice is steady, but there's an unmistakable edge of determination in it. "You're not just disrespecting me, officer," she says. "You're disrespecting everything I've worked for and the people I represent. You've crossed a line, and you're about to find out how serious that is." The moment hangs in the air as the officer, once so certain of his authority, stands rooted in his place, unsure of what to do next. As the tense silence grows, Judge Maya Carter steps back, carefully opening her purse again. This time, there's no hesitation. She pulls out her official judicial badge, holding it up high for Officer Harrison to see, letting its significance speak for itself. "I'm Judge Maya Carter," she declares, her voice unyielding and commanding. "I've been a judge in this city for over a decade, and I've presided over cases involving your department." The words hit like a thunderclap. The camera focuses tightly on Officer Harrison's face, capturing the instant his arrogance melts away. His eyes widen in shock, and for the first time, a flicker of disbelief crosses his features. The confident stance he had moments before now crumbles, and his hands reflexively release her purse, allowing it to fall to the ground between them. The power dynamic has shifted entirely. The camera zooms out slowly, showing the once dominant officer now visibly shrinking in the face of his own ignorance. His breathing becomes more labored, almost as if he's struggling to comprehend the monumental mistake he's just made. The weight of his assumptions and prejudices hang heavy in the air, leaving him stunned and silent. The bystanders, who were once passive observers, are now visibly shaken. The camera shifts to their faces, showing the subtle but undeniable discomfort of those who have just witnessed the humiliation of the officer. Some shift uncomfortably, realizing that they've been unwitting witnesses to something much larger than they'd initially assumed. The silence that follows is thick with realization. A realization that they, too, are complicit bystanders in a moment of racial profiling. A pregnant pause hangs in the air. Officer Harrison stammers, his previously authoritative voice now soft and faltering. "You're a judge?" he asks, his words thick with disbelief. His body language crumbles, and his face visibly pales as his earlier cocky demeanor gives way to guilt. He takes a small step back, his posture slumped as the gravity of his mistake settles in. Judge Carter doesn't flinch. She stands tall, her presence unwavering as she fixes him with a piercing stare. She's calm, but her words land with precision. You didn't know. That's the problem. Her voice is sharp, cutting through the air with quiet intensity. She steps forward, not to intimidate, but to drive her point home. You assumed that because I'm black, I didn't belong here. That's the issue you need to fix. The officer's guilt is palpable now. His hands twitch at his sides as if searching for something to do, anything to undo the mess he's made. But he knows there's nothing to be done. The moment of realization hits him harder than any reprimand could, and his voice falters as he attempts an apology. I didn't know. I'm sorry, ma'am. His words are tangled with shame, his attempts to salvage the situation failing with every syllable. He looks down at his feet, unable to meet her eyes, the full weight of his racism now exposed. Judge Carter does not soften. Sorry is not enough, she replies. Sorry doesn't undo the harm you've caused, not just to me, but to everyone who's ever faced your judgment simply because of the color of their skin. Her voice is steady, but the emotion beneath her words is undeniable. She's no longer just speaking for herself. She's speaking for every black person who's been underestimated, judged, or discriminated against. The officer's face reddens further as he continues to stutter. I didn't mean any harm, ma'am. I thought— You didn't think, Judge Carter interrupts firmly. That's the problem. Her voice carries the weight of someone who has been through countless battles against ignorance and bias, but today she's determined to stand up for something more than herself. You assumed, she continues, the words deliberate and powerful. You assumed that because I'm black, because I'm a woman, because I don't fit your narrow view of authority, that I didn't deserve respect. That's your mistake. The officer falls silent, his expression one of defeat. There's no escaping the truth that has just been laid bare in front of him. The crowd now watches with rapt attention, some with looks of disbelief, others with admiration for Judge Carter's poise in the face of such humiliation. The camera cuts to the onlookers, some of whom are now exchanging looks of silent understanding, others clearly moved by the power of her words. One by one, they realize that this moment is about more than just a judge standing up to an officer. It's a moment that highlights the deep-rooted racial biases that continue to affect everyday interactions. This isn't just about me, Judge Carter says, turning her attention to the bystanders. It's about the countless others who've faced this same treatment, the countless black men and women who've been held to impossible standards, treated with suspicion, or outright dismissed simply because of who they are. It's about making sure that no one ever has to go through this again. There's a collective silence as her words settle. The camera lingers on Officer Harrison, his face now stripped of any arrogance or defensiveness, showing a man who's been forced to reckon with the consequences of his actions. The crowd, now fully engaged, watches as the officer's earlier arrogance crumbles, replaced by something closer to shame. The camera zooms out, capturing the widening scope of the scene. The once indifferent crowd is now shifting uncomfortably, some slowly nodding in agreement, others casting sideways glances at Officer Harrison, their faces twisted with disgust. There's an undeniable tension in the air, a collective realization that this moment is no longer just about a simple interaction between a woman and a police officer. This is a public reckoning. It's a moment where the deep, insidious nature of racial bias is being laid bare for all to see. Judge Carter doesn't allow the moment to slip by. Her voice grows stronger, louder, and more resolute as she turns to the gathering crowd. You can't just look at someone and assume they're guilty because of the color of their skin. This happens every day to people like me, and we're tired of it. Her words hang in the air like a challenge, not just to Officer Harrison, but to everyone who's ever turned a blind eye to racial profiling or dismissed its existence. The camera focuses on the bystanders now, some visibly uncomfortable, while others look at each other with newfound awareness. The people who had once stood idly by now see that what's happening in front of them isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger problem that needs to be addressed. The gravity of Judge Carter's words sinks in, and the crowd begins to realize that this is a moment of truth, a moment where they can no longer ignore what's been happening around them. Officer Harrison, once so sure of his position, is now visibly shaken. His body language shifts, and his shoulders slump under the weight of his own actions. He stands there, awkward and speechless, unable to meet Judge Carter's unyielding gaze. The arrogance he once exuded has been replaced with a sense of regret, but the damage is already done. His authority in the eyes of the public has crumbled, and the crowd can feel it. Judge Carter continues her speech, her voice now resonating with the power of someone who has spent years fighting for justice and equality. You owe me more than an apology, officer. You owe an entire community an apology. She pauses for a moment, letting her words sink in. There's no backing down now. She's calling out Officer Harrison and calling on the entire system to recognize the consequences of its blind prejudice. Her words hit like a powerful reminder that justice isn't just about the law. It's about how people are treated on the streets, in stores, in their daily lives. The crowd, now fully aware of the situation, begins to murmur. The weight of public accountability settles heavily on Officer Harrison. His initial arrogance, his need to assert control over this situation, has evaporated. He is now a figure caught in his own ignorance, exposed in front of those who had once trusted him to uphold the law impartially. The silent condemnation from the crowd is far louder than any accusation could ever be. People begin to look at him with a mixture of disappointment, confusion, and disbelief. His authority has completely unraveled, and there's no easy way out. The silence that follows is thick and uncomfortable, stretching on as the camera pans over the faces of the people watching. Some are silently nodding, others glancing nervously at Officer Harrison, but all are aware that they are witnessing a pivotal moment, a confrontation not just between two individuals, but between the systemic forces of injustice and the power of accountability. Judge Carter's unwavering stance has set the stage for a public reckoning, and Officer Harrison is the one left to bear its weight. Finally, Officer Harrison speaks, his voice low and almost inaudible. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean... His apology comes too late, and it's evident from the tone of his voice that he's not just apologizing to Judge Carter, but to everyone around him who has ever been unjustly treated because of their race. His words fall flat, hollow in the face of the public shame he now faces, but the damage is already done. Judge Carter doesn't soften. Sorry doesn't undo the harm you've caused, officer. She shakes her head, a look of quiet resolve on her face. This isn't just about me. It's about all the people you've mistreated, all the assumptions you've made based on nothing but the color of their skin. The crowd's tension eases, but only slightly, as the realization of just how deeply ingrained these prejudices are begins to take root. The onlookers are no longer passive witnesses. They're now participants in this moment of change. Their eyes are opened to the reality of the problem, and they feel the collective weight of responsibility to confront and challenge injustice when they see it. Officer Harrison lowers his head, his face flushed with embarrassment. He knows he has no excuse. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now feels like a weight he can no longer carry. His shame is visible. He stands as a representative of the prejudice that's plagued the system, and there's no easy way for him to shake it off. Judge Carter stands tall, her calm demeanor never wavering. She looks directly at him one last time, not with hatred, but with the quiet strength of someone who has been unjustly judged too many times before. She offers a simple, clear message. You have a choice now. You can either keep hiding behind your assumptions, or you can start truly learning what justice looks like. The camera focuses on Officer Harrison's face, a mix of guilt confusion, and fear of the repercussions ahead. He stands in front of Judge Carter, knowing that he is now not just the subject of her words, but of a collective reckoning that will echo long after this moment is over. The crowd watches silently, but the message is clear. The moment has changed them. It's not just a shift in the dynamic between Judge Carter and Officer Harrison, it's a shift in the entire system, a reminder that accountability starts with each individual, and that change begins when we refuse to accept injustice. As the camera pulls away, Judge Carter walks away with unwavering dignity, her back straight, her footsteps echoing in the quiet air. The crowd slowly disperses, but the conversation that has begun is far from over. The ripples of accountability will extend beyond this moment, a story that will continue to inspire others to stand up against prejudice in all its forms. The video transitions to the next day, where we see Judge Maya Carter sitting in her courtroom. The atmosphere is calm and professional, the sound of papers rustling and quiet murmurs filling the space. The camera focuses on her face, showing her listening intently to a case, her eyes sharp and focused. Her presence commands respect, a stark contrast to the unjust encounter she had just the day before. As the camera pans out, we see Judge Carter presiding over the case with the same authority and composure she's known for. Her posture is upright, her demeanor unwavering. She's in control, demonstrating to the courtroom that justice, fairness, and strength remain her guiding principles. The day's proceedings unfold without a hint of the tension from the previous encounter with Officer Harrison, but there's a clear underlying message. This is a woman who has faced prejudice head-on and continues to fight for fairness in her work. The camera shifts to a local news segment, showing a clip of a press conference. The police department is issuing a public apology for Officer Harrison's actions, admitting the mistake and acknowledging the racial bias displayed during the interaction. The segment also reports that the department is launching a new initiative aimed at addressing racial profiling and improving training for officers, ensuring accountability and fostering trust in the community. Judge Carter's case has become the spark for a broader conversation across the city as citizens, activists, and policymakers begin to engage in much-needed dialogue about racial justice, bias, and the responsibility of law enforcement. The news anchor briefly mentions the role Judge Carter played in confronting injustice, and her quiet yet powerful words have already resonated deeply throughout the city. The community is beginning to understand that justice is not just about following the law. It's about holding people accountable and demanding change when things go wrong. The camera cuts back to Judge Carter as she's finishing up her workday, now walking through the courthouse halls, her posture straight, her face resolute. There's a sense of quiet satisfaction in the air. Change has begun, but it's just the beginning. The city is starting to change too, influenced by the ripple effect of one courageous woman who stood up against injustice in a very public way. Her voiceover plays softly over the closing scene, offering a powerful reminder of the responsibility each of us has in the fight for justice. We can't wait for change to come to us. We must demand it and create it every day. The camera lingers on Judge Carter's determined face, the final image of her walking down the courthouse steps, the sun beginning to break through the clouds in the distance. The scene fades to black, leaving behind a strong message. Change begins with those who have the courage to speak out, to stand firm in their values, and to demand justice in the face of adversity.